Sala, and I'll be talking to you a little bit about the classical civilizations, which is a really integral part of AP World History Modern. Now, can everybody hear me okay? Is my mic okay? My visuals? Please let me know if something's up with my mic. Okay, I take that as a yes. Okay, so again, I'm Varun Karathala. I'm a sophomore from Georgia. I received a 5 on the 2019 AP World History exam, and I'm just a history buff. I'm a classical period buff, and I love talking about AP World History in its entirety, especially the classical period, because I love the imperial age. I love the formation of empires. So first things first, what is Fiveable? So Fiveable is like Twitch, if you know what Twitch is. So Twitch is kind of a platform for gaming streamers to kind of relate to their audiences in a seamless platform. So it allows streamers to kind of ask questions to their hosts, and hosts to interact with their streamers. And it's very, very interactive. And that's what we're trying to emulate here at Fiveable. We try to emulate a classroom type approach wherein learners can talk to their streamers, and streamers can talk back to their learners through comment sections, polls, as you can see. So it's a very, very interactive learning environment from students and teachers from across the nation. So Fiveable membership. We at Fiveable run a membership platform that's $5 per month. And with this $5 per month, which obviously you can get a free account and view all of our streams while they're live, by paying $5 a month, you can view a library of all our documents and streams. So for example, if you missed today's stream on AP World History or my later stream on study skills and the classical civilizations now, you can view these on the library streams and documents and kind of get the full experience in AP World History, if you know what I'm talking about. Also, we're releasing an essay grading pilot later in this year, where you can send over your essays, practice SAQs, practice DBQs, practice LEQs, and we have a team of experienced streamers and staff members ready to kind of respond to your concerns with regards to writing. So what kind of streams are coming soon? First, today we have a pre-AP organizing, reading, and note-taking stream with myself and Skylar Walters at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Tomorrow we have a What's New in AP World History Modern stream with Ali Thiessen at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And we also have a Neolithic Revolution stream with Patrick Lasser at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. So make sure to join all these streams. They're very informative to your learning as a student and to your comprehension of the AP World History curriculum. So what are we going to be talking about in this stream? First, we have the classical period, kind of a prelude to what the classical period is and what goes on in the classical period in terms of key terms, vocabulary, things like that, what precedes that. Second, we have our key vocabulary and terms, first of all, because, these are essential terms for you to know in the classical period and you to know in the rest of the AP World History curriculum, because again, the classical period is a fundamental base for your entire learning in the curriculum. And lastly, we have periodic connections. So after we talk about some key vocabulary, terms, empires, and a prelude, we'll kind of connect everything that you've learned to the big picture. What's going to happen after this period, the post-classical period, the modern period, even today, what are kind of these terms connecting to? Because again, the AP World History Modern course starts around 1200 CE. We can't talk too much about the classical period because it's not more than a base. Okay. So again, before we start this presentation, does anybody know anything about the classical period from their teachers, previous study? Please leave it in the chat section. Yeah, it's a very, it's a very, very informative period, and we're talking about the span of AP World History because it has so much. The imperial age starts during this period. Rome, of course. Rome is one of the biggest classical civilizations, and it really begins to consolidate bureaucracies. Again, yeah, Greece. These are all, this is stereotypical classical civilizations. We have states combining with other states and creating huge empires, imperial age. This is what the classical period is. Rome and Greece are, quintessential examples of what civilizations in the classical period become. All right, so we're going to analyze a primary source document here, and it's from Alexander of Macedon, who obviously Alexander the Great is a great imperial leader, and we're talking about the broad span of AP World History and the classical civilizations. He's going to be talking about imperialism. So he says, "Who does not desire such a victory by which we shall join places in our kingdom, so far divided by nature, and for which we shall set up trophies in another conquered world?" So as you can see in the map down here, Alexander the Great conquered territories from Egypt to Persia to the Middle East to Greece, obviously, and then India. So Alexander the Great is the highest level person to be talking about imperialism, and this guy to be saying that joining places in our kingdom, so far divided by nature, he's talking about the multicultural differences within his vast empire. As you can see, he conquered such a vast empire, and he prided himself and conquered so much territory. So that's really the prelude to the classical civilization. These emperors kind of wanted to consolidate more territory, wanting to symbolize their rule, have a baseline to their rule. So next, we're going to talk about kind of more of a prelude, what the Neolithic Revolution was, things like that. From 8000 BC to 600 BCE, the world's first civilizations formed, and they were characterized by utilizing complex agriculture, record keeping, structural bureaucracies, and organized religion. We first see these things start to form in this period from 8000 BC to 600 BCE, as people begin farming, they begin forming communities, and they begin doing things like that. So Shruti's about to join our stream. She's my co-streamer, so I'm going to invite her on screen to talk about a little bit more about the classical civilizations.
Hi guys, sorry for technical difficulties, but
you can take it from here.
Okay, yeah. So talking more about early civilizations, I think Varun just covered that. So the next one would be the classical era and consolidation of the classical era. So after the foundations era, which set the stage for what would happen later and all the civilizations that would come later, civilizations started to flourish and become empires. So essentially it started to transition from normal civilizations that stayed near the rivers from which they were born, essentially, and they started to expand as emperors started to gain more power, and then people started to gain more power overall. So they used military force usually to consolidate the rule over neighboring territories, but there were also other things. For example, the rise of multinational and ethnically diverse empires, which meant that these empires were spanning expanses of land that covered a multitude of different people, of different ethnicities, etc. There had to be some other way to essentially bring them to a common culture, a common ground, so that they felt like they belonged in that empire and they didn't, the chance of them wanting to leave the empire didn't increase. So thus, culture and philosophy spread from across the empire, and it also influenced pre-modern artists in the Renaissance period, which should come later.
So now we're moving on to vocabulary and terms. First, we want to talk about empires. An empire is almost the #1 term to know in world history, I would say, because it shows up in many periods. I mean, you guys start with the Mongol Empire, the Persian Empire during this period, the Roman Empire, as many of you know. We have the Russian Empire. Everything, almost every country in today's world is an empire or was an empire in some extent. An empire is a group of countries under a single authority, extending past regional boundaries via conquest. So before, again, as Shruti said, before this period, we had civilizations, which weren't really empires. I mean, they were one state. But during this period, we see these states and the rulers conquer more and more and more territory. As you can see on the left, the Roman Empire conquered so much territory through conquest. And on the right, we see the Persian Empire, which conquered so much territory, again, under Darius I and Xerxes and things like that, through conquest, and Cyrus the Great. So here's a funny meme just to jog our interest in the imperial period. So people who like TV say just one more episode. Book readers say just one more page, and people with a sweet tooth just say one more piece of chocolate. But really, empires, and the Roman Empire in this period, just say one more province. And that really characterizes this period. It's just people and empires searching for more and more and more land within unequivocal hunger. So empires were really characterized by three things. First, we have conditioned and charismatic leaders. So conditioned and charismatic leaders allow for the proper command and organization of empires. And we see people like Alexander the Great of Macedonia. After he dies, the entire empire collapses because there wasn't a strong military and bureaucratic leadership after Alexander the Great's death. We also see strong militaries because when you have such a multiculturally diverse and ethnically diverse population, you need a strong military to kind of quell dissent, to kind of control the populace. And that's where we see strong militaries start to come in. They also come in to kind of conquer territory, defend the landed lands against foreign invasions, which were kind of common during this period, as empires, again, just said, one more province, one more empire. We see the Greek military as a strong example of strong militaries. In the Greco-Persian Wars, which is talked about in many cases. In the movie 300, we talk about the Greco-Persian Wars, where we have a Persian naval force almost 4 times the Greek size. But the Greek military on foot and in the naval force defeat this military just because of their strength and organization. We also have complex bureaucracies, and these really maintain the empires in the classical period because they ensure the distribution of royal mandates to ethnically diverse populations. Often we have shared local central government in Persian satrapies, which were basically like the Persians gave autonomy to kind of local segments of the population under local leaders, a bureaucratic mechanism. And we also have the Han civil service examinations, where they kind of test the people applying for bureaucratic positions to make sure they're educated. So bureaucracies help manage the empire at a full extent.
Okay, so next we see the rise of complex government. Because of the fact that these empires, again, as Varun mentions, expand over vast expanses of land, just one more province. The need to incorporate a complex government that takes into account the needs, or maybe not the needs, it takes into account each person that's living in that empire, obviously came to the forefront. So empires began to develop appendages to their modes of government, like their own limbs were the governors that they had. As they separated their empire into provinces, the governors were set up to for each empire, this was different in name and role, but essentially their base job was the same, in that they kept the local people in check so that the emperor didn't have to look over every single person on his own. So for example, as mentioned in the last slide, a shared local central authority in the Persian Empire were the Persian satrapies, and then a common currency in case of the Lydian Empire was also put into place, because common currency kind of helps people that want to buy things in different areas from which they are. It helps traders, it helps merchants who want to transport goods and services, and essentially they can use the same coin system in order to get money for their goods and buy the goods that they want. And also in the Roman Empire, we see the rise of uniform legal codes, which essentially help codify the base laws for which the Roman Empire is expected to govern. For example, we see the 12 Tables of Rome. And so this helped people essentially know that whenever they did something, or whatever, crime they committed, they would essentially get the same punishment wherever they were in the Roman Empire. It varied, of course, based on who you were, but as a baseline, legal codes were essentially the same. And we also get infrastructural advancements. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the transport of goods and services across empires is an important part of what helps an empire grow and what helps it become prosperous. So here we see Persia's Great Royal Road that connected the empire, and so merchants and traders could transport goods, services, and people as they saw fit.
So now let's talk a little bit about labor systems. So in such a regionally diverse and expansive empires, we have labor systems and labor needs, because we have so much land that you need to farm, so much villages that you need to fill up with merchants, and labor systems emerge as established relationships of workers to their masters or employers, and this was really needed to fill the labor gap apparent in most classical societies, as previously mentioned, because we had so much things to do and so little people to do so based on this vast expanse of land. So first we have slavery. In many classical societies, including Rome, when they conquered, regions, they took some of their people, the most strong men, the most strong children, in the case of the Ottomans, and they used them as slaves for menial tasks and things like that. And this was kind of a way to fill the labor gap in ancient societies, taking the people as spoils of war and putting them into bondage for life. We also see serfdom begin to form when farmers don't get enough money for their crops. Farmers start losing money, they're in debt. So they basically go into serfdom, and they work for a certain master who provides them with shelter, with food, and with protection. So it wasn't as popular as it would later become in the feudalistic or post-classical period, but it was truly a strong last resort for farmers, and it filled the labor gap in farms and things like that, and reduced the amount of debtors in ancient society in the classical period. We also see social stratification as a much more permanent method of filling up the labor gap. And this is apparent even in today's society, especially in India and China. These things are even today really, really rigid. In India, under the caste system, we have the untouchables working as slaves almost. We have the peasant class working in the peasant position for their entire lives and their children's lives. So it's almost slavery in that they have a stable worker pool by putting people into certain classes and not letting them get out. The picture on the right is basically in the Roman Forum. They're selling slaves that they got from conquest. As I mentioned, the Roman Empire was very fond of slavery to fill their labor gaps. So here's a case study of the Roman society. Shruti found this amazing image on the internet, which kind of gives you an example of social stratification and how the Romans kept their people in subjugation and put in their certain place in society. So in the beginning, the top class, we have senators, as you can see in the purple circle. And then we have patricians or aristocrats, people who had certain influence in the economy, in the political state. And then we have the equites, or the wealthy cavalrymen, who, again, it shows you that the cavalrymen had a high state. The military was a very honorable profession in the Roman Empire. And then we have plebeians, or commoners. And these all people have one thing in common. They have civil rights. But, I mean, some of them are nobility, like the senators, patricians, and equites. And then we have the plebeians, who are not really nobility. And so this type of social stratification really makes the empire very, very successful in labor needs and things like that. On the outside of this map, we have servi, or domestic servants, who really have no liberty or citizenship in the society we're talking about here today. That's the kind of social stratification that we have and continue to see in Eastern societies and Indian society.
Okay. Now, at this point, maybe you guys, if the content that we've covered so far sounds familiar, or you guys want a little more help in clarifying, please leave an emoji that lets us know how you feel about what we talked about so far in the chat.
That's great.
Yeah, we're getting some good ones.
I haven't seen that one before. Star one.
The Star Eye one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so moving on, we got our organized religion, which also, or reorganized religion, which starts to become an important part of empires. Again, the large part of having an empire, controlling an empire, is helping consolidate your power and helping control people through any means possible. So for religion specifically, it began to emerge as a way in which rulers could legitimize their rule. So people or other rulers or people that wanted to rise up would be less likely to do so because they believed that the ruler was divinely ordained by God. For example, in the Chinese Empire, specifically the Han Dynasty during this time period, we see the rise of something called the Mandate of Heaven, which essentially means that the emperor of China is divinely ordained by God to rule over China, and no one else should rule over China at that time. So this also led to the continuation of polytheism in different areas. So, for example, we saw in the Roman Empire, we saw paganism during the vast array of Greco-Roman gods that Rome essentially borrowed from Greece, but also it was used as a means of controlling the population in that monumental architecture was built. The gods said something, and then it was essentially the way of the gods that was supposed to be the way the people spoke and act. So this fear of gods essentially kept people from not rebelling, from being obedient. And we also see religion incorporating a rigid social structure, especially in Hinduism over classical India, as we see with the caste system that came from, the caste system that is essentially built in the name of Hinduism, in the name of the vast array of gods. And so we see this social structure being taking hold in India and then controlling the population as a means of that. We also see the rise of monotheism on the opposite side of the spectrum. For example, the three universalizing religions, Judaism plus Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam. And so we see that people start to, especially later on in the Roman Empire, as Emperor Constantine adopted Christianity, the spread of Christianity increases all throughout the empire, all throughout Europe, and we see that that starts to control the population a lot more as well.
And these emperors really try to use religion as a means of making their rule more meaningful, because in these empires we see, especially with Constantine, as Shruti was talking about earlier, he uses Christianity as a means to say, okay, I'm doing something good for the gods, because his entire population under at least Theodosius believed in Christianity. So when they're making these monumental architecture, making these huge strides, it's like they're doing something for the gods, and it makes their rule much more meaningful to the people. And we also see, again, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam become the three universalizing faiths, and Judaism kind of starting the monotheistic age in this period. So we see missionaries. Missionaries are individuals often hired by the central government who work to spread his or her religious beliefs to an ulterior population. And this is, again, where we're talking about Constantine spreading religion. He kind of hires missionaries to spread his Christianity and things like that. We see missionaries become much more popular later on, but they kind of emerge in this period spreading three universalizing faiths: Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam. And they're very proliferate in this period. All right, Shruti, you can talk about state-sponsored ritual.
Okay, so we see state-sponsored rituals, which were, again, extremely common during this period because of the fact that along with reorganizing religion, you have to have something that, again, legitimizes rule, says to the people that you're governing that, hey, I'm ruling over this place, I'm ruling it because of the gods. So here I am doing a state-sponsored ritual that's telling everyone, essentially telling everyone, that God has ordained me to rule over this empire. So we see that, again, rulers incorporated this all throughout empires. They did it in India through the forms of pujas, in that they had some servings or offerings to the gods, and then a lot of people came and watched, and essentially they were told that because of this offering, now that God is on this ruler's side.
And again, as Mr. Beckman mentioned about Buddhism and Islam also being spread by missionaries, that's very important to know, because especially in places like China, we see Buddhist missionaries coming in from India, making Buddhism important in China and Japan. We see Islamic missionaries coming into North Africa, spreading into Carthage, spreading into even Spain. So every universalizing faith really has missionaries. We also see monasticism, which is really the appeal of religions like Christianity and Buddhism, because again, we have a lot of patriarchy in this period. Women can't do much outside of their household. But monasticism means living in a religious community apart from secular society and kind of adhering to rules of chastity, obedience, and frugality. And monasticism was kind of applied to women in this period. And it allowed them from escape from their neutral gender goals, and allowed them to pursue religion as a means of making their political state more well known.
Now we also see monumental architecture, as we mentioned earlier, in that, again, with all this religion that's going on, missionaries, rituals, monasticism, there has to be some form of like a grand gesture for which rulers can say, I'm doing the most as I can for the gods, and so they want me to rule. So rulers began to erect monumental architecture. They spread their influence too, so that when travelers came or people came from different regions of the empire, they could see this architecture and then revel in the glory of whatever empire they were in at the time. And it also assisted in converting their subjects to the state's patron faith. So essentially, usually this empire sponsored a particular religion or a particular faith. And so if these buildings and structures were constructed in the name of that faith, then the people that were seeing that were essentially more likely to be converted as well.
Okay, so we also see public works projects in this period. So as the classical period progressed, imperial rulers again began to use the sponsorship of public works projects to kind of consolidate their rule over multi-ethnic populations. Because, for example, the first type of public works projects, we have the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, or other religious architecture, as Shruti mentioned earlier. Especially in Constantinople, we have Orthodox Christianity begin to take a hold. And the Hagia Sophia was initially a church devoted to Orthodox Christianity, And it kind of exemplified the emperor's care for his people and care for spreading the Christian religion. And so it made people more likely to cooperate with the emperor, saying that he is doing good for the world. And we also have the second type of public works projects where it's really practical public works, like the Colosseum in Rome. It's used for entertainment, used for, having fun, things like that. Bread and circuses is the trademark of the Roman Empire. And so they use these religious or practical public works projects to kind of consolidate their rule over people that are from different cultures, different ethnicities, different backgrounds, and they give them something common to kind of support and to benefit from.
Okay, so in some empires, not all, we see the rise of city-states, which were like towns in the classical period, but they were also a lot more than that, having their own political structure, oftentimes having their own, their own small form of government. So again, they were often semi-autonomous, which meant that they were granted a vast variety of regional liberties so that they could govern their pocket of land like the people wanted them to govern it. So when I'm talking about examples of city-states, again, the most famous example, could anyone say one of the Greek city-states in the chat? Yep, Athens for sure. So we see, again, the Greek city-states. The most famous of them would be Athens, one of them, and Sparta. So they were extremely autonomous, and they're famous for this fact, in that, for example, you see both Athens and Sparta being in the same, empire, the Greek Empire, or being in the same vicinity, I guess. But they're also, again, completely different in ideology. For example, Athens was more focused on philosophy and a sort of democratic government, while we see the Spartans, on the other hand, that are a lot more focused on warfare, regional warfare. Their kids are warriors. So again, they have very different focuses, which also leads to, as we see later, the Peloponnesian Wars, since Athens and Sparta are both powerful city-states in their own right, and they fight over which gets to be in charge of the other one. And we also see the Sumerian city-states, which are very different in that their ideologies don't differ as much as Athens and Sparta did, but they also, again, have their own notions of who should be more powerful, how this should be governed, and thus this results in internal instability, which eventually leads to the Sumerian Empire's downfall.
So what is patriarchy? Now, patriarchy is a very permanent term in today's world, and it's a social or governmental system in which the father or eldest male was regarded as the head of the family. This system is present in nearly every classical society, and really exists to this day in many Eastern societies and even Western societies, and jobs. There's a huge fight today politically about wages, equal treatment in the workforce. Though patriarchy still exists in today's world through male chauvinism. Women were generally restricted to household duties during this period, but still, as we stated earlier, retained the opportunity to pursue a life of monasticism and religions like Christianity and Buddhism. And this made these religions, again, very popular. So in the bottom pictures, we see, in the second picture, we see polygamy, which is a really, really permanent method of patriarchy, because we see these Persian emperors, or even Persian commoners or aristocrats marrying different women, or 3 or 4 women, instead of one woman as we would expect in today's society. In the right, we see a painting, an Egyptian painting about women doing menial tasks. So women are not portrayed in a good light during this period. I mean, we see political women kind of rising to power later on, but women are really restricted to household duties during the classical period.
Okay, so another essential thing we see in this time period is cultural. As mentioned, very important term to know when you're talking about how cultures were transmitted, diffused across empires, and even between empires through trade. So again, in the broadest sense of the term, cross-cultural interaction meant that technologies, ideas, goods, and disease were being transmitted from area to area, whether that's within a vast empire from one empire to another, or is from the one empire to another. If they were both, again, at this point, if they were both in close contact. So again, So during this period, a lot of cultural diffusion can be attributed. A lot of trade routes were put in place. For example, you see the Silk Road, which again is very famous for being a major trade route in that East Asian and general region, where different empires could exchange goods and services and essentially spread their own culture and take in some aspects of the cultures that they met along the way. We also see the Saharan trade route in Africa and the Indian Ocean trade route, which expanded a vast portion of Asia and also helped, I guess, people expand and get their goods to different places, as well as transmitting their own cultures.
And that's just a funny picture. This guy saying he got his orange belt because of cultural diffusion, because really we won't see karate if we didn't have Eastern cultures. We won't see Taekwondo if we don't have Eastern cultures. So that's really an example of cultural diffusion in today's world, these different martial arts from areas of the world. Hellenization. So Hellenization refers to the spread of Greek culture throughout the Eastern Hemisphere. And this is a very, very integral term in the classical period, because Alexander the Great, he respected Greek culture a lot. And this guy was actually taught by Aristotle. So when the Macedonian emperor conquers Greece, and conquers also Egypt, again, Persia, India, and places like this, he spreads the Greek religion worldwide. And so the Greek language and culture has become nearly universal in the old world because of this thing called Hellenization. And the classical period in the end is really referred to as the Hellenistic period because of the rapid spread of Greek culture. Down at the bottom, we see this picture. Persia simply exists, and Alexander the Great thinks it's free real estate, which is, really what he thought it was. I mean, he conquered so many regions, and it's just like the Roman Empire. It's just one more province. To him, it was just one more empire to conquer and conquer and conquer and spread the Greek language and culture, which is really his main goal in the grand scheme of things. To the right, we see this famous painting of Alexander the Great, which you may see anywhere in the AP World History curriculum. This is used almost universally.
Okay, so here we're going to transition from talking about terms, and we're going to talk about the era as a whole when we're talking about the empires and specific civilizations. So there were certain characteristics that made this era, the classical era, what it was. So the first of those, there's a vast variety of characteristics, but if we're going to condense some of them, especially based on what we've been talking about, the first one was that the consolidation, the rule of early civilizations, gave way to more centralized states, focused upon governmental structure and expansion. So this statement is essentially phrased like a thesis statement that you would see during your long essays for AP World History, the ones that you have to write. So that's essentially, keep that in mind as you're reading these. But also you got the standardization of religion. Again, we talked about reorganized religion, which played a greater role in daily life as a means of controlling the population, so keeping the population busy, and within the political sphere as well. And then finally, we also see, again, trade, cultural diffusion, and defensive alliances form from and between cities, become a central aspect of civilization. So when we're defining civilization, especially during the classical era, you see trade is a huge part of it. Cultural diffusion, as different cultures start getting transmitted, as well as defensive alliances that essentially help protect smaller empires from being consumed.
So we see consolidation, religion, and trade, the three key characteristics of civilization. So do you want to talk about the Roman Empire?
Sure. So, okay, we're going to talk about the Roman Empire. Some important dates to know is that first, of course, the creation of the Roman Republic. Now, it's important to note that this is not the creation of the Roman Empire yet. It's the creation of the Roman Republic, which meant that, again, this is essentially the era during which Julius Caesar was after the creation of it. But then in 31 BCE and to 14 CE, we see the rule of Augustus, who reintroduces monarchy to Rome and essentially starts the Roman Empire as we know it today. And in 313 CE, a bit of a time jump, we see Emperor Constantine adopts Christianity for the Roman Empire, which becomes instrumental in spreading Christianity and lessening Christian persecutions as we go on. in the region specifically. And finally, 476 CE, the Roman Empire collapses after Germanic invasion. Of course, as always, the Huns, during Emperor Augustulus' rule.
Does anybody know what the edict that Emperor Constantine passed in 313 CE that standardized Christianity? Yes, it is the Edict of Milan. That's what it's called. It's a key term in world history, not as much AP World History Modern, but it's good to know in the grand scheme of things.
Okay, so we're going to talk about some attributes of the Roman Empire specifically. Of course, it was an empire after the Roman Republic set the stage, but again, they were a small but powerful city-state at first. But how they spread in power essentially have to do with all the wars that they fought. For example, the famous Punic Wars against Greece and Carthage. If y'all remember Hannibal or have heard of Hannibal, he was the Carthaginian general that essentially the Romans ended up wiping from the face of the planet, which was not fun, but it also allowed Roman Republic to become as strong as it became, and then allowed it to become an empire later on. Which again, one more province, Rome annexing more and more territories when Augustus reverted the land to a monarchy, and that allowed it to expand and become an empire. We also see religion during the Roman Empire. So what's interesting is that first, of course, the conversion to Christianity doesn't happen until much later in the Roman Empire's career, or stay, I guess, in the region. But officially, the first Roman religion was the wide pantheon of Greco-Roman gods. So these were, again, Jupiter, Venus, etc. You see these gods that this faith wasn't strictly enforced, but we also see the rows of monumental architectures that supported these gods, and it also gave the people something to be wary of. But then we see Christianity, which grew out of the Jewish tradition, and it informed the culture of Rome as much as the culture of Rome influenced it. And so when persecution occurred way until the 313 CE, does anyone remember or know why the Christians were persecuted until Emperor Constantine adopted the religion? If you don't, it's fine. I just wanted to know where we were at. But if you weren't aware, the Christians were mostly persecuted because of the fact that they didn't pay taxes. Because of, they paid. I'm pretty sure it was because they didn't pay taxes because of the fact that they were the Christian culture at the time. It didn't believe in giving money to the Romans or giving money outside of, I guess, what their religion informed them. So this is why persecution existed more than the fact that they were different from them. Also, I guess the spread of Christianity kind of scared the Romans into thinking that they had some sort of loss of power. But again, this persisted until 313 CE, when the Edict of Milan, as Jed mentioned and Varun mentioned, legalized Christianity. So this law would make Christianity Rome's state religion, again, as a last-ditch effort to reunify the empire.
And the Christians during this period are really, really zealous. Like, the Romans' only policy was to adopt the pagan religion, and you could practice your own religion. Like, the Christians could practice their own religion, but they had to, in some way or form, accept the Roman religion. But they wouldn't do that. And so this led to many Christians dying in the Colosseum as gladiators and into lions and things like that, and getting persecuted and blamed for so many things under the Roman Empire because they just wouldn't accept. They were so stubborn in their religion.
And finally, we see contact, or cultural diffusion. So during the Roman Empire, again, as we mentioned earlier, religion, political structures, philosophies, again, a lot of these were also adopted from the Greeks. So the philosophies of Socrates and Aristotle, specifically, they got that from the Greeks. And so they informed that when making decisions or philosophical debates or what have you. It became a larger Greco-Roman sphere. And to facilitate contact between empires as well, they used their large expanse of roads and waterways. Again, the Roman aqueducts are very famous. They weren't necessarily transportation, but they were very famous. in that they helped transport goods across territorial lines. There were also, the Romans were also heavily active upon the Silk Roads, which even though it was a little bit east, they also set to facilitate the spread of their own culture, their own goods and services so that they could grow as well.
So the second empirical example we'll show here is the Han Dynasty. So some dates to know. In 200 BCE, a peasant revolt under the revolutionary Liu Bang dispelled the Qin regime of bigotry and established the Han regime. Now the Qin regime, you need to know that it's the first empire in China, and it really consolidated rule over the entire Chinese territory. In 130 BC, the Silk Road was created by Han rulers, sparking a trade burst between the Han Dynasty and the Roman Empire. In near 9 CE, after a short period of internal instability, Wang Mang takes over, establishing the Xin Dynasty. And he's really poised for failure, as should they mention the Zhao Mandate of Heaven kind of deposes him because he has a lot of ineffective reforms and natural disasters occur under his reign. And a weakened Han Dynasty regains control from 23 CE to 220 CE. So the Han Dynasty, how was it classified as an empire? So first we have, again, Liu Bang's successful peasant revolt, and the Han Dynasty consolidates its rule over the entirety of China, just like the Qin Dynasty, and establishes a strong governance under Confucian bureaucracy. So does anybody know what Confucianism is? Please leave it in the comment section, the chat section, just to give us a background about what you know. Again, it's okay if you don't know anything. I mean, all right. So under the guise of diplomacy, heavily militaristic Han leaders begin to expand their rule over neighboring territories, including places like Guangdong, Korea, and Vietnam, because that's how they consolidated their rule over new territories. Instead of going out and militarily conquering territory, they sent diplomats, and they kind of coerced these empires into giving them tribute and making them tributary states, as they do under the Tang Dynasty later on. Religion under the Han Dynasty. Again, we're talking about Confucianism. It embeds this belief in the government practices and domestic practices into its people and things like that. And Confucianism was a belief system created during the Zhao Dynasty as a response to kind of the militaristic rule of the Zhao rulers. It was an alternative to the militaristic rule, and it was established under the philosopher Confucius. It stressed filial piety, which is familial relationships, relationships within the family, and stressed societal harmony and the importance of education. So Confucianism is a very, very influential religion in China, and it kind of was the glue of Chinese society even after the Han Dynasty. It existed up until the Ming Dynasty, even the Qing Dynasty, and exists to this day within Confucian beliefs because they stress the family much more than we do in Western society. Han Dynasty Cultural Diffusion. So in 130 BCE, again, the Han Dynasty created the Silk Road as a system of westward trade and cultural diffusion. And later on, the Silk Roads emerged into a predominant trade route within Asia. And this also spurs a cultural spur and a trade spur between a golden age of trade between the Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty. And experiencing, there was a heightened trade between the Han Dynasty and the Roman Empire and between the Han Dynasty and their tributary states. Because along the Silk Road, they were spreading their ideas, their prestige, their religion, and their culture. And so it led to many places having a Han footprint on it. So to wrap it all up, here's the influence of the actual classical period, because in the AP World History Modern course, the classical period is not stressed nearly as much. So we want to kind of give you a background as to how it connects to other pieces, other eras, and other time periods. So first, after Rome's fall in the late 5th century, Europe falls into a period of disarray, turning to feudalism under ambitious warlords. So as I talked about earlier, we see serfdom in this period, but serfdom begins to take a much bigger role after this period, as we don't have a central authority after the Roman Empire's fall. So instead of empires kind of consolidating territory after this period, we see the church and religion become much more prominent. Patriarchy continues to play a major role in post-classical civilizations. As you can see, the feminism movement in today's world, the suffrage movement in the 1800s, so it's a very, very influential part of modern-day society and later society. We also see, as Shruti mentioned, classical theology and philosophical precepts under Aristotle, Socrates, and philosophers like that. It gains a foothold in post-classical societies during the Renaissance period from 1300 to 1600 CE, which you'll definitely learn about in AP World History Modern. So know that these kinds of things, this Renaissance art, Van Gogh's art, the writings of Rousseau, John Locke, these things that you'll learn about later in the period, they emanate from the writings and art of the